3:42 p.m. The industrial engine plant was a symphony of roaring compressors and hot iron. On the test bench sat a prototype, achieving an unprecedented 18% increase in efficiency. Elena Voss, the 35-year-old CEO, stared at the schematics, her eyes narrowed. She turned to her senior engineers and asked, "Who designed this engine?" Silence swallowed the room. In the corner, a 9-year-old girl waiting for her father looked up. She raised a small hand and spoke. "My dad did." The factory froze. They looked at the father, a man wearing a grease-stained maintenance uniform, a nobody in a room of geniuses. Watch closely. This matters. Daniel Kovac was a man who spoke the language of machines better than the language of people. At 41, his face was a living map of 1,000 sleepless nights and unresolved dreams, etched with the quiet, persistent exhaustion of a man who worked double shifts just to keep a flickering light in his daughter's eyes. For 8 years, he had walked the concrete floors of the Voss engine plant. He wasn't the man with the badge or the man with the corner office. He was the maintenance technician. He was the man you called when a high-pressure bolt was stripped or when a hydraulic line decided to spray hot oil across $1 million floor. Daniel didn't have a high-rise view or a nameplate on a desk. He had a heavy, dented steel toolbox and a pair of hands that were perpetually stained with the dark, stubborn ink of engine oil. He was the ghost in the machine, the one who fixed the world so that others could claim they built it. But deep inside, Daniel understood the soul of an engine. To him, the metallic clatter wasn't noise. It was a conversation. He could hear a slight misfire in a cylinder before the high-tech sensors even registered a micro-vibration. He knew the way steel expanded under heat, and he knew the way air became lazy when it hit a sharp corner. His life outside the factory was a delicate, heartbreaking balancing act. Daniel was a single father, raising his 9-year-old daughter, Sophia, alone in a small apartment that always smelled faintly of lavender and industrial soap. His wife, Maria, had passed away 3 years prior from a sudden, undetected heart condition, leaving him with a hollow house and a little girl who possessed her mother's laugh and her father's observant silence. Because Daniel often volunteered for the late-night maintenance rotations to earn the overtime pay, Sophia became a fixture in the factory's worker break room. She would sit in a corner, surrounded by the heavy smell of diesel and the rhythmic thumping of the assembly lines, diligently finishing her math homework or sketching in her notebook. The workers treated her like a mascot, but Daniel kept her close, always within the line of his sight. Daniel never talked about his past to his co-workers. They saw a quiet man with a wrench. They didn't see the dusty framed technical certificate from a prestigious European university that hung behind the door in his apartment, a relic of a life in mechanical research that had been violently interrupted by a lack of funds, a sick wife, and the cold reality of needing a paycheck now. The factory was currently vibrating with a different kind of energy, high-stakes panic. Elena Voss, the visionary CEO, had bet the company's entire future on a new line of fuel-efficient, low-emission engines. It was her all-in moment. However, the initial physical prototypes were a disaster. On paper, the simulations were flawless, but in the real world, the metal was screaming. After 40 minutes of high-load operation, the engine blocks would overheat, the thermal sensors would trigger a shutdown, and the fuel efficiency would plummet. The senior engineering team, men with triple-digit salaries and Ivy League degrees, had spent 4 months locked in a cycle of redesign and failure. They had rewritten the fuel maps, they had changed the alloy composition, they had argued in boardrooms until their voices were hoarse. But every time the test stand ignition turned, the result was the same: smoke, high-pitched alarms, and the bitter taste of defeat. Daniel watched it all from the periphery. As the maintenance man, his job was to clean up the mess. He was the one who had to disassemble the failed, glowing hot prototypes so the official engineers could inspect the damage. He began to notice a recurring shadow. The theoretical design was mathematically perfect, but the physical casting of the housing created a blind spot. A tiny, overlooked corner where the cooling air hit a dead end and began to swirl into a vortex of stagnant heat. He didn't write a formal memo. He didn't think anyone would listen to a man in blue coveralls. In a world of titles, a janitor's insight is just noise. Instead, as he sat alone during the graveyard shift, lit only by the hum of the safety lights, Daniel began making tiny pencil-drawn notes in the margins of the technical blueprints he found lying on the greasy shop floor. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He just couldn't stand to see a machine suffer. He wanted the engine to breathe. The factory floor at 2 a.m. was a cathedral of shadows. During one particularly quiet Tuesday night, the air thick with the smell of cooling metal and industrial floor wax, Daniel decided to test a theory he had been sketching for weeks. The rest of the world was asleep, but Daniel's mind was racing. He stood before the latest failed prototype, a heavy, silent mass of high-grade aluminum that had become the factory's greatest shame. Daniel didn't reach for a computer or a simulation program. He reached for a manual lathe and a set of precision files. He didn't change the complex combustion timing. He didn't touch the electronic fuel injection mapping. Instead, he spent 4 hours hand-grinding the primary cooling fan blades. He adjusted their pitch by exactly 4.5 degrees. Then he used a pneumatic drill to reposition a single thermal sensor 3 inches to the left, moving it out of the stagnant heat-soak zone of the exhaust manifold and into the direct path of the newly optimized airflow. These were surgical, tactile adjustments. They were the kind of insights you only gain when you spend your life touching the machines, when you know how metal feels when it's under stress. To the engineers, it was a data point. To Daniel, it was a heartbeat. When he finished, his uniform was soaked in sweat and his hands were trembling with adrenaline. He turned the ignition key in the test stand console. The engine didn't just start, it purred. It sounded different, deeper, smoother, more confident. He ran it at 50% load for an hour, then 70%, then a full 100%. The temperature gauges stayed in the perfect, vibrant green zone. The fuel flow was a steady, beautiful line on the digital readout. For the first time in the history of the Voss plant, the prototype wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Daniel felt a surge of pure, unfiltered joy he hadn't felt since his university days. He looked at the master technical drawing, the one the lead engineers had been swearing at all afternoon, and pulled a stubby pencil from his pocket. In the bottom margin, near the revision block, he scribbled a few words in his precise, slanted handwriting. Cooling flow bottleneck bypassed. Fan pitch corrected to 4.5. Sensor repositioned for real-time flow. He didn't sign his name. He didn't claim the patent. He didn't even date it. He simply left the blueprint on the lead engineer's desk, tucked his toolbox under his arm, and went home to wake Sophia for school. He was content with being the silent ghost who helped the world turn. The next morning, the factory was a whirlwind. A junior engineer named Mark, overworked, underpaid, and desperate to give the CEO some good news, found the drawing. He stared at the handwritten notes. At first, he was angry. Who touched the master files? But as he traced the logic of the notes, his eyes widened. It made perfect sense. Mark didn't ask questions. He didn't have time. He implemented the physical changes onto the current prototype and ordered a high-load stress run. To the absolute shock of the entire engineering department, version 4.2 didn't just pass. It obliterated the previous performance records. It was 18% more efficient than anything the industry had ever seen. The news hit the executive offices like a lightning bolt. Elena Voss, who had been drafting her resignation letter and preparing for bankruptcy, arrived at the testing bay within 20 minutes. She was a woman who demanded excellence and worshipped data. She stood in the center of the bay, the roar of the perfectly functioning engine filling the room like a victory anthem. "This is a miracle," Elena said, her voice shaking with relief as she pointed at the thermal mapping on the wall-size monitors. "This jump in efficiency, it's unprecedented. It saves the company. It saves every job in this room." She turned to the senior engineering team, her gaze piercing. "I want to meet the person who finally saw what we were all missing. Who designed this final iteration? Who made these fan adjustments?" The senior engineers stepped forward, trying to salvage his macro vision, stepped forward, trying to salvage his pride. "It was a highly collaborative revision, ma'am," he stammered. "After reviewing the previous failures, we decided to iterate on the cooling dynamics during the late shift. It was a collective breakthrough. Elena Voss wasn't just a CEO, She was the daughter of a mechanic. She knew the smell of a lie. She picked up the physical blueprint from the workbench. She saw the pencil marks. She saw the slanted human handwriting that stood in stark contrast to the sterile, digital precision of the CAD designs. Collaborative, Elena repeated, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. These notes weren't made by a committee. They weren't made by a computer. They were made by someone who knows how air actually moves through burning steel. Who wrote these notes? Who touched this prototype last night? The room went into a deafening silence. The senior engineers looked at the floor. They didn't know. They hadn't bothered to check the security logs. They were too busy taking credit for the success. In the corner of the worker break room, Sophia had stopped her coloring. She looked at the blueprint in Elena's hand. She recognized that paper. She had seen her father hunched over their small kitchen table at midnight, drawing those exact interlocking gear shapes on the back of her old homework sheets. She saw the powerful woman looking for an answer, and she saw her dad trying to blend into the shadows near the trash bins. Sophia stood up. Her small footsteps echoed on the concrete as she walked toward the circle of giants. My dad writes like that, she said, her voice small but clear, cutting through the heavy tension of the factory. She pointed her finger directly at Daniel, who was standing 20 feet away, holding a dirty rag and looking like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. Daniel Kovac felt the heat of 100 stares burn into the back of his neck. Every head in the plant, from the highest paid engineer to the security guard at the gate, turned toward him. The machine seemed to go quiet just to hear his response. He wanted to vanish. He was a man who lived in the safety of the background, a man who had learned that in the corporate world, if you aren't the hunter, you're the prey. He gripped the grease-stained rag in his hands, his knuckles turning white. He shook his head slightly, a low, hesitant rumble in his chest. I only made some maintenance notes, ma'am. I didn't mean to interfere. I just thought, I thought it would make the block easier to service if it wasn't glowing red. Elena Voss didn't look at the chief engineer again. She walked straight toward Daniel, the blueprint held in her hand like a holy relic. She didn't see the dirty uniform. She didn't see the grease under his fingernails. She looked into his eyes and saw a level of intelligence that she hadn't seen in her boardroom in months. She held up the paper, the pencil marks visible in the bright factory lights. You adjusted the fan pitch by 4.5 degrees, Daniel. You moved the sensor out of the wake. The engineers told me this was a collective breakthrough. But this handwriting, it says you're the only one who actually understood why the machine was dying. Tell me, right now, what did you see that they didn't? Daniel looked at the floor, then at Sophia. His daughter was watching him with wide, shimmering eyes. Eyes that were full of a pride that no paycheck could ever buy. He realized he couldn't lie. Not to her. He let out a long breath and stepped toward the test stand. He didn't look at the senior engineers. He looked at the engine. His hands moved instinctively over the metallic casing, tracing the lines of the air intakes. It's the corner of the housing, ma'am, Daniel explained, his voice gaining a sudden, resonant strength. The janitor was gone. The engineer had returned. The design team wanted it to look aerodynamic from the outside. They wanted it to be pretty. But inside, at high speeds, the cooling air was hitting a 90-degree dead end. It was creating a pocket of a stagnant, superheated air right over the primary sensors. The computer thought the whole engine was about to melt, so it would dump massive amounts of fuel to try and cool the combustion chambers. But it was a feedback loop. It just made the efficiency crater. He pointed to the fan he had hand-filed the night before. By changing the pitch, I created a vortex. It doesn't just push the air, it pulls it through the corner. It sweeps the heat away before the sensors can panic. You didn't need a $3 million redesign. You just needed to let the engine breathe. The senior engineers stood in a semicircle of shame. Their faces were a mosaic of red, pale, and gray. They had spent $3 million on cloud-based simulations and wind tunnel data, and a maintenance man had solved the problem with a manual lathe, a pencil, and a deep understanding of reality. Elena Voss turned to her chief engineer. Her voice was a whisper that felt like thunder. Is he right? Did we miss a stagnant air pocket in the housing? The man hesitated, then he looked at the thermal readout again. He let out a long, defeated sigh, his shoulders dropping like a lead weight. We, we focused on the internal combustion physics, ma'am. We assumed the housing airflow was a solved variable. Daniel, he's absolutely right. The vortex pitch fixes the drag coefficient. Elena turned back to Daniel. The atmosphere in the factory had shifted. It was no longer a workplace. It was a classroom. We spent months and millions of dollars trying to fix something that a technician understood in 1 week, Elena said, her voice echoing through the steel rafters. She wasn't shouting, but every word felt like a gavel striking a block. We've been hiring based on degrees and titles. We've been valuing the person with the loudest voice, but we stopped looking at the people who actually touch the machines every day. Daniel isn't just a mechanic. He is the reason this factory still has a future. She looked at the engineers who were staring at their feet, and then she looked at Daniel's humble blue-collar uniform. Daniel, she said, her tone softening into a deep, genuine respect. I want you in my office tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. sharp. We need to talk about your role here. This uniform, it doesn't fit the man you are. She knelt down to Sophia's level, ignoring the oil on the floor. And Sophia, thank you. Thank you for pointing out the truth. Your father is a very gifted man. I hope you know that. Sophia beamed, her chest puffing out with a pride that nearly brought Daniel to tears. He stood there, stunned, as the CEO walked away. He had spent 3 years believing that his dream was buried under a pile of medical bills and grief, that he was destined to be a ghost in the factory shadows. But in that moment, as the afternoon light faded through the high windows, the heavy weight he had been carrying finally began to lift. He wasn't just the man who fixed things anymore. He was the man who had seen the wind. The meeting the following morning was nothing like the reprimand Daniel had feared. He hadn't slept. He had spent the night worrying that he would be fired for unauthorized tampering with proprietary equipment. He wore his best shirt, the one with the slightly frayed collar, and sat nervously on the edge of the plush leather chair in Elena's top-floor office. Elena Voss wasn't looking at a spreadsheet. She was looking at Daniel's old technical certificate, which she had requested his permission to see. Why didn't you submit these ideas formally, Daniel? She asked, pouring him a cup of coffee herself. A man with your university background. Why were you hiding behind a mop and a wrench? Daniel looked at the steam rising from the cup. Because in a place like this, titles matter more than truth, ma'am. I've seen good men get fired for being too smart for their pay grade. I needed a job that stayed in the building so I could be there for Sophia. I couldn't afford to be a disruptive engineer. I just wanted to do my work and go home. Elena leaned back, a look of profound regret on her face. Then the system is broken, not just the engines. I built this company on the promise of innovation, but I realized yesterday that I had built a wall between the people who think and the people who do. I want to tear that wall down. She didn't offer Daniel the title of chief engineer. She knew that would be a political disaster with the board, and she knew Daniel was too humble to accept it. Instead, she laid a contract on the desk. I'm creating a new department, she said. The Practical Integration Group. I want you to lead it. Your job will be to sit in every design meeting from day one. You will take the engineer's perfect digital designs, and you will find the real-world flaws before we ever cast a single ounce of steel. You will be the voice of the machine. Daniel's eyes blurred. I don't know what to say, ma'am. Say you'll help me build engines that actually breathe, Elena replied with a smile. And in return, the company will cover the full cost of you completing your master's degree. We'll provide a flexible schedule so you never have to miss another of Sophia's school plays. I want her to see her father in the room where the decisions are made. Daniel felt a lump in his throat that made it hard to breathe. He thought about Maria. He thought about the 3 years of struggle. He picked up the pen and signed the paper. As Daniel walked out of the executive suite, he saw Sophia sitting in the high-ceiling lobby. She was drawing in her sketchbook again, but this time she wasn't tucked into a dark corner of a break room. She was sitting on a designer sofa, her feet swinging as the sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows. How did you know, Sophia? Elena asked, walking out with Daniel. How did you know those notes were his? Sophia didn't even look up from her page. She just pointed to a small, stylized mark at the bottom of her drawing, a tiny interlocking gear with a 4.5 written inside. He draws that on my lunch bags every single day, ma'am. He says it's the secret to making things move. He says if the gears don't match, the heart doesn't beat. Elena Voss stood there for a long time after the two of them left for breakfast. She looked at her factory from the high window, a place she thought she knew perfectly. She realized that her most valuable asset wasn't the patents or the massive casting machines. It was the human eye that was willing to notice a 4.5-degree difference between a billion-dollar failure and a world-changing success. She had been looking for a genius in a suit, but she had found one in a blue uniform, and all it had taken was the honesty of a little girl to show her where to look. 6 months later, the Voss Kovacs series engine was officially in mass production. It had become the gold standard of the industry, praised by every trade journal for its unrivaled thermal stability and innovative airflow management. The company was no longer on the brink of bankruptcy. It was expanding into 3 new countries, and the stock price had tripled. Daniel Kovacs still arrived at the factory at 7 a.m. every morning. He still preferred the smell of cold steel and industrial oil to the scent of expensive cologne. But he no longer wore the anonymous blue coveralls of the forgotten man. He wore a clean, dark gray technician's uniform with a new title stitched in gold thread over his heart, Director of Practical Integration. The culture of the Voss plant had changed fundamentally. The walls between the departments had been torn down. Every Friday, the design engineers were required to spend 4 hours on the assembly line, and the mechanics were invited to the design review meetings. The Vortex pitch was now a global patent, and Daniel's name was listed first on the legal filing. He wasn't the loudest man in the room, but when he spoke, the entire engineering department stopped talking. They had learned a $2 million lesson, that the most important insights aren't always found in a lecture hall. Sometimes they are found while holding a wrench at 3 in the morning. Sophia returned to the factory on a warm Saturday afternoon. She walked past the rows of gleaming new engines, each one a testament to her father's vision. She saw the workers, men and women who now looked up and smiled when they saw her, calling her the chief inspector. She stopped at her father's new station, a bright, organized lab filled with high-tech flow testing equipment and a large table for drawings. Daniel was hunched over a new schematic, a pencil behind his ear. "Did you invent it, Dad?" Sophia asked, touching the cold, polished steel of a finished engine. Daniel laughed, a warm, rich sound that echoed through the bay. He picked his daughter up and set her on the edge of the workbench. "No, Sophia, I didn't invent it. I just helped it breathe. Remember the rule? Everything works together." "I remember," she said, hugging him tight. Sees Daniel and Sophia in the distance. Sees Daniel and Sophia in the distance. The mechanic and the little girl who saved the company. She realizes that the most important question she ever asked wasn't, who designed this engine? The important question was, who actually understands the machine? The answer had saved her business, but it had also reminded her of a truth the world often forgets, that talent has no uniform, and that genius often hides in the people we choose not to see. As the massive hangar doors opened to let in the golden afternoon light, the engines hummed in perfect unison, a steady rhythmic heartbeat of a world that was finally breathing properly. If you believe that real talent doesn't depend on job titles, only on who's paying attention, subscribe for more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been overlooked? How did you finally show the world what you could do?